Walt Whitman, father of free verse. I chose to speak about Walt Whitman after becoming inspired while reading his biography. His freestyle poetry has no end rhyme or regular meter. He is known as the poet of democracy for his vision of celebrating the common man. He also bears the title of American poet, journalist, and humanist. He was born May 31st, 1819, in Long Island, New York. He was the second of 9 children born to his parents, Walter and Louisa Van Velser Whitman. The family moved around a lot due to financial difficulties, and by the age of 12, he found employment at a law firm and later worked for the Patriot newspaper. His family decided to move to West Hills, leaving him behind, where he found work at the Long Island Star. This is where his education began, learning the trade of becoming a journalist, visiting the libraries, museums, and attending plays and operas. He also began to write poetry and published it anonymously in the New York Mirror. He moved back home with the family when he was 17 and started teaching school. After about 5 years, moved back to New York to pursue his career in journalism. In 1855, he self-published Leaves of Grass. His inspiration came from Ralph Waldo Emerson's 1843 essay, The Poet. Emerson described Leaves of Grass as the most extraordinary piece of wit and wisdom that America has yet contributed. Always receptive for a new adventure, his determination reminds me of Ruth Norman, Uriel, who, learning a trade and mastering it, moves on to the next challenge. His poem, Song of the Open Road, speaks of his philosophy of picking up and moving on. Song of the Open Road. Alons, we must not stop here. However sweet these laid-up stores, however convenient this dwelling, we cannot remain here. However sheltered this port, and however calm these waters, we must not anchor here. However welcome the hospitality that surrounds us, we are permitted to receive it but a little. In December of 1862, during the Civil War, he went searching for his brother George at Fredericksburg, Virginia, who was listed as injured, sustaining a gun wound to his cheek. He stayed with his brother's unit for a couple of weeks, spending spare time visiting the field hospitals. Later on, Captain George Whitman was captured along with 332 officers on September 30th, 1864, and finally confined at the Confederate military prison in Virginia until he was released. On New Year's Day in 1863, earning the trust and respect of the doctors at the Battlefield Hospital, Whitman was put in charge of a trainload of casualties who had to be transferred to hospitals in the capital. While the wounded were being moved from a train to a steamboat for the trip north, Whitman wandered among them, writing down their messages to their families and comforting the soldiers. This is a quote from the biography of Walt Whitman by Ed Folsom and Kenneth M. Price. For Whitman, the massive slaughter of young soldier Christs would create for all those who survived the war an obligation to construct a nation worthy of their great sacrifice. The America that Whitman would write of after the Civil War would be a more chastened, less innocent nation, a nation that had gone through its baptism in blood, and one that would from now on be tested against the stern measure of this bloodshed. While in Washington, D.C., he stayed a few days in order to visit the wounded soldiers from his hometown of Brooklyn, knowing at a deeper level that he would remain there for the duration of the war. He always wanted to be a doctor if he hadn't become a journalist. To supplement his income, he worked as a clerk in the War Office, then in the Attorney General's office. Whitman states, "The doctors tell me I supply the patients with the medicine which all their drugs and bottles and powders are helpless to yield." Whitman also held the view that some of the nurses were too genteel to care for the soldiers. One nurse at Armory Square Hospital, Nurse Amanda Atkin, wrote to her sister concerning her distaste for Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman visits our hospital almost daily. He took a fancy to my fever boy and would watch with him sometimes half the night. He is a poet and I believe has written some very queer books about free love. Describing Whitman's personal appearance, she writes, "He is an odd-looking genius, with a heavy frame, tall, high head, with straggling hair, and very pink rims to his eyes. When he stalks down the ward, I feel the prickling of my thumbs, and never speak to him if not obliged to do so, though I hear some of the other ladies offer him a cup of tea, which he enjoys with the relish of a little talk with them. With all his peculiar interests in our soldier boys, he does not appeal to me." Whitman reminds me of the moderator who before and during World War II gave of himself, administering love, clairvoyant guidance, spiritual therapy, psychic and physical healing to the families and their loved ones in the service. He was in New York in 1865 visiting his mother when he read about the assassination of Abraham Lincoln on April 14th. It had a profound impact on his writing. He wrote the poems "When Lilacs Last and the Dooryard Bloomed," and one of his best-known poems, "O Captain, My Captain," 1865. In 1873, he suffered a stroke, partially paralyzing his left leg and arm. He decided to move to Camden, New Jersey, staying with his brother George and his wife. Later was able to purchase a home from the royalties from his Leaves of Grass book and lectures about Abraham Lincoln. Longtime friend and neighbor Horace Trubell published 9 volumes of Whitman's final years. Whitman describes to Horace his inspiration for Leaves of Grass in 1888. The reality, the simplicity, the transparency of my dear, dear mother's life was responsible for the main things in the letters as in Leaves of Grass itself. How much I owe her, it could not be put on a scale, weighed, it could not be measured. It can only be apprehended through the intuitions. Leaves of Grass is the flower of her temperament active in me. My mother was illiterate in the formal sense, but strangely knowing. She excelled in narrative, had great mimic power. She could tell stories and impersonate. She was very eloquent in the utterance of noble moral axioms, was very original in her manner and in her style. On March 26, 1892, Walt Whitman passed away in Camden, New Jersey. Right up until the end, he'd continued to work with Leaves of Grass, which during his lifetime had gone through many editions and expanded to some 300 poems. He was buried in a large mausoleum he had built in Camden Harley Cemetery. Thank you.